Think the Middle Ages were all about knights in shining armor, chaste maidens, and pious monks praying away their desires. Think again. If you thought medieval people spent their days avoiding anything remotely sexual, buckle up, because the truth is so much weirder, wilder, and more jaw-dropping than any history textbook dares to admit. Forget what you learned in school. The real story of medieval sexuality is a fever dream of bizarre rituals, public spectacles, magical underwear, and enough animal testicles to make a modern butcher blush. Let's be honest, when you picture the Middle Ages, you probably imagine a world where sex was hidden, shameful, and strictly controlled by the church. But the reality, medieval people were just as obsessed with sex as anyone today, maybe even more so, considering the lengths they went to in pursuit of pleasure, fertility, and, sometimes, just plain survival. From sleepovers with strangers to courtroom sex trials, from aphrodisiac feasts to magical birth control. The sexual history of the Middle Ages is a wild ride through the human imagination. So, let's dive into the most bizarre sexual practices of the Middle Ages, the ones that make modern dating apps look like Sunday School and 50 Shades of Grey seem like a bedtime story for toddlers. Let's start with one of the most ridiculous courtship rituals in human history, bundling. Imagine you're a medieval teenager. Your parents have found you a potential spouse. You're probably hoping for a little privacy, maybe a romantic walk in the moonlight. Instead, you get tied into a sack and thrown into bed with a complete stranger while your entire family watches. Bundling was the medieval version of a supervised sleepover, except way more awkward and with much higher stakes. Young couples would be wrapped together in bed, fully clothed, often with a thick wooden board placed between them to prevent any inappropriate contact. Because nothing says romance like with sleeping next to someone with a plank of wood separating your body, and your parents peeking in to make sure you're not getting too cozy. But here's where it gets truly insane. This wasn't just tolerated by parents, it was encouraged. Families would actually invite suitors to spend the night bundled up with their daughters, thinking this was a safe way to let young people get to know each other. It's like medieval parents looked at the concept of chaperone dating and said, you know what this needs? More physical restraint and shared body heat. Bundling was so common that there was an entire industry built around it. Special bundling bags were manufactured for the purpose, and some even had drawstrings to keep things extra secure. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. Medieval parents were terrified of premarital sex, but also thought the best way to prevent it was to put two hormonal teenagers in bed together and hope for the best. Spoiler alert, it didn't work. Historical records show that pregnancy rates among bundling couples were significantly higher than among those who courted in more traditional ways. Turns out, putting a young couple in bed together even with burials doesn't actually prevent nature from taking its course. Who could have possibly seen that coming? Religious leaders of the time were constantly complaining about bundling, calling it immoral and dangerous, but they couldn't stop it. It was too deeply ingrained in rural culture. It's the medieval equivalent of parents today trying to ban social media. Technically possible, but practically impossible. If you think modern aphrodisiacs are weird, wait until you hear what medieval people were eating to get in the mood. Forget chocolate and strawberries. Medieval love feasts were all about animal testicles, bird brains, and enough spices to bankrupt a small kingdom. The star of medieval aphrodisiac cuisine. Animal testicles, specifically, the testicles of young bulls, rams, and boars, which were considered the ultimate sexual enhancement food. Medieval cookbooks are full of recipes for stones. That's what they call testicles, because apparently medieval people were too classy to say balls. These were prepared in every way imaginable. Roasted, boiled, fried, ground into powder, or mixed into wine. If there was a way to cook testicles, medieval chefs found it. But testicles were just the beginning. Medieval aphrodisiac menus included sparrow brains because eating the brains of tiny birds was supposed to enhance sexual performance. Dishes made from the reproductive organs of various animals were believed to transfer fertility and virility to the eater. It's like sympathetic magic, but with significantly more organ meat. The spice trade wasn't just about flavor, it was about getting laid. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, and saffron were all considered powerful aphrodisiacs, which explains why these spices were worth their weight in gold. Wealthy nobles would host elaborate love feasts where every dish was designed to increase sexual desire and performance. Imagine going to a wedding today and being served a 7-course meal of animal genitals and brain matter, all designed to help the newlyweds have better sex later. The wedding cake itself was often made with ingredients like pine nuts, almonds, and honey, not because they tasted good together, but because they were all considered sexually stimulating. Medieval physicians wrote detailed treatises on aphrodisiac cooking, complete with specific recipes and preparation instructions. These weren't underground publications, they were legitimate medical texts studied by scholars and doctors. The obsession with aphrodisiac food got so extreme that certain ingredients were actually banned during religious fasting periods, not because they were unhealthy, but because they were considered too sexually stimulating for people who were supposed to be focusing on spiritual matters. Imagine your priest telling you to give up animal testicles for Lent. If you think having your parents meet your significant other is awkward, Try having a room full of nobles watch you lose your virginity. Welcome to the medieval bedding ceremony, where privacy wasn't just discouraged, it was illegal for aristocratic marriages. The logic behind witnessed consummation was actually pretty straightforward. In a completely insane medieval way, marriage wasn't considered legally valid until it was consummated. And since marriage contracts often involved massive transfers of land, money, and political power, there needed to be witnesses to prove the deed was done. Because nothing says legally binding contract like having your wedding guests watch you have sex. The process was elaborate and humiliating in equal measure. After the wedding ceremony, the bride and groom would be escorted to their bedchamber by a procession of wedding guests. The bride would be undressed by female relatives while the groom was undressed by male relatives because apparently medieval people believed in gender-segregated strip shows. Then came the main event. The couple would be placed in bed together while witnesses, usually high-ranking nobles, church officials, and family members, would stand around the bed and watch. We're not talking about a quick peek to confirm things were happening. These witnesses would stay for the entire duration, sometimes offering encouragement and advice during the process. But wait, it gets worse. In some cases, witnesses would actually examine the bedsheets afterward, looking for blood as proof of the bride's virginity and evidence that penetration had occurred. Imagine having to present your bedsheets to a committee of judges like you're submitting evidence in a court case, which, technically, you were the most insane part. This wasn't just for royal marriages. Any marriage involving significant property or political alliances could require witnessed consummation. We're talking about thousands of medieval couples who had to perform their most intimate moment in front of an audience of relatives and strangers. Some couples tried to game the system by having witnesses wait outside the bedroom door, but even this wasn't always acceptable. Court records show cases where marriages were annulled because the consummation wasn't properly witnessed, meaning the couple had to do it all over again, this time with proper supervision. The practice was so normalized that medieval etiquette manuals actually included instructions for proper bedding ceremony behavior. Both for the couple and for the witnesses, there were rules about where to stand, what to say, and how long to watch. Medieval people turned voyeurism into a formal social institution. If you think reality TV is invasive, just be glad you weren't born into a noble family in the 14th century. Medieval aristocrats didn't just have sex, they scheduled it like a corporate board meeting, complete with astrological consultants and religious advisors. We're talking about a time when getting pregnant required more planning than a NASA space mission. The medieval obsession with timing conception was based on a combination of astrology, medicine, and religious doctrine that created the most complicated baby-making schedule in human history. Couples would consult astrological charts to determine the most favorable planetary alignments for conception, because apparently, medieval people believed the stars gave a damn about their sex lives. According to medieval medical texts, the best time to conceive was during the waxing moon, when the woman was in a state of hot, humoral balance, and when specific planets were in favorable positions. Some texts recommended waiting for particular saints' feast days, believing that children conceived on holy days would be blessed with special qualities. Imagine having to check 3 different calendars just to figure out when you're allowed to try for a baby. But the timing obsession went way beyond just picking the right day. Medieval physicians provided detailed instructions about the optimal time of day, usually midnight, the ideal weather conditions, warm and humid, and even the proper direction the bed should face east, toward the rising sun. Having sex became a logistical nightmare requiring more preparation than a medieval siege. The gender selection methods were absolutely bonkers. To conceive a boy, couples were instructed to have sex during the waxing moon while the man tied off his left testicle, because medieval people believed boys came from the right testicle and girls from the left. The level of anatomical ignorance required to believe this is truly staggering. Religious considerations made everything even more complicated. The church prohibited sex on Sundays, Wednesdays, Fridays, during Lent, during Advent, during menstruation, during pregnancy, while breastfeeding, and on approximately 183 other days throughout the year. Medieval couples had to navigate a minefield of religious restrictions just to find a day when sex wasn't considered sinful. Wealthy families would actually hire specialists, a combination of physician, astrologer, and priest, to create personalized conception schedules. These fertility consultants would analyze the couple's birth charts, medical histories, and religious obligations to determine the optimal times for baby making. It's like medieval people invented fertility apps, except with more superstition and significantly less scientific accuracy. The pressure to produce heirs according to these elaborate schedules was so intense that some couples would travel hundreds of miles to be in the right location during their optimal conception window, because apparently geography also affected baby-making success. Medieval people turned underwear into religious artifacts, and the results were exactly as weird as you'd expect. We're talking about a time when your choice of undergarments could determine whether you'd have children, and when getting dressed required consulting both a priest and a physician. The girdle of Venus wasn't just a poetic name, it was an actual belt worn around the waist or hips. often made of silk or linen and inscribed with religious prayers, astrological symbols, or magical incantations. These belts were believed to enhance fertility, ensure safe childbirth, and improve sexual performance. But fertility belts were just the beginning of medieval sexual accessories. Women would wear special amulets containing everything from powdered unicorn horn, actually narwhal tusk, to ground-up gemstones, all designed to enhance their reproductive capabilities. Some amulets contained written prayers or biblical verses, because apparently God needed written reminders about what you wanted him to help you with. The most bizarre fertility accessory was the conception stone, a small rock or crystal that women would insert into their undergarments during sex, believing it would help them conceive. Different stones were thought to produce different results: emeralds for boys, sapphires for girls, and diamonds for twins. Medieval people thought they could control genetics with jewelry. Men weren't left out of the magical underwear game. They had their own fertility accessories, including special rings worn on specific fingers, amulets containing animal parts, usually testicles, because medieval people were obsessed with testicles, and even specially blessed loincloths that were supposed to enhance sexual performance. The church got involved in the underwear blessing business. Priests would bless fertility belts, conception amulets, and even bedsheets, charging fees for their services. It's like medieval people turned their sex lives into a religious subscription service. Some fertility accessories were so elaborate, they required instruction manuals. We have surviving texts that explain exactly how to wear certain belts, which prayers to recite while putting them on, and what to do if they stopped working. Medieval people created customer service for magical underwear. The most expensive fertility accessories were made from materials like silk imported from China, gold thread, and gemstones, making them luxury items that only the wealthy could afford. Poor people had to make do with homemade versions using local materials, creating a class system based on the quality of your magical underwear. The belief in fertility accessories was so strong that some women refused to have sex without wearing them, and some men would refuse to sleep with women who weren't properly accepted. Medieval people turned getting dressed into a prerequisite for getting laid. Think modern divorce proceedings are humiliating. Try having to prove your sexual dysfunction in front of a panel of judges, medical experts, and random courtroom observers. Welcome to the medieval impotence trial, where privacy went to die and dignity was legally inadmissible. In the Middle Ages, the church made divorce nearly impossible. But there was one loophole. If a woman could prove her husband was impotent, she could get the marriage annulled. Of course, proving impotence required more than just her word. It required a full-scale legal investigation into the couple's sex life, and the process was as bizarre as you'd expect. First, the couple would be examined separately by medical experts, who would inspect their genitals for signs of physical abnormality. Then they'd be questioned under oath about their sexual history, frequency of attempts, and specific details about what did or didn't happen in bed. But the real nightmare was the trial by Congress. Yes, that's what they actually called it. If the medical examination was inconclusive, the court could order the couple to attempt sexual intercourse under supervision. The supervised sex sessions took place in special rooms, either in the courthouse or in rented chambers, with medical experts and court officials watching through peepholes or from behind screens. The couple was given a specific amount of time to perform, and if the man couldn't achieve or maintain an erection, the marriage could be annulled. Some men tried to cheat the system by using various enhancement methods: medieval Viagra made from herbs, animal parts, or magical potions. Court records show cases where men were caught trying to smuggle aphrodisiacs into the trial chamber, leading to even more humiliating examinations to ensure they weren't using artificial assistance. The most insane part: these trials could drag on for months or even years, with multiple supervised attempts required before a verdict was reached. Some couples had to perform for the court dozens of times, because apparently medieval judges believed in giving people plenty of chances to prove their sexual competence. Women who brought impotence charges faced their own They had to prove they were sexually willing and capable, which often involved intimate examinations and detailed questioning about their own sexual responses. The assumption was that if a man couldn't perform, it might be the woman's fault for not being attractive or enthusiastic enough. The social consequences of impotence trials were devastating. Win or lose, everyone involved became the subject of public gossip and ridicule. Some men preferred to accept annulment rather than undergo the trial, essentially admitting to impotence to avoid the humiliation of public testing. If you think the medieval church was all about sexual purity, think again. The same institution that preached abstinence and condemned lust was also running the biggest sex trafficking operation in Europe. In 12th century London, the borough of Southwark had 18 licensed brothels, employing over 1,000 prostitutes. And who owned these brothels? The Bishop of Winchester. The church's involvement in prostitution wasn't a secret side business. Church leaders argued that prostitution was a necessary evil that prevented worse sins like rape, adultery, and homosexuality. So they decided to regulate and profit from it, just like today's government. The business model was genius in its hypocrisy. The church couldn't officially condone prostitution, but there was nothing in canon law preventing them from collecting rent from brothel owners. Medieval brothels operated under strict church regulations. Prostitutes had to follow dress codes, work specific hours, and live in designated areas. They were forbidden from working on religious holidays, couldn't refuse customers without cause, and had to submit to regular medical examinations. The financial arrangements were elaborate and exploitative. Prostitutes paid rent to brothel keepers, who paid rent to property owners, who paid taxes to the church. It was a pyramid scheme with sex workers at the bottom and bishops at the top. The most insane part: the church used profits from prostitution to fund religious activities. Money earned from sex work was used to build churches, support monasteries, and pay for religious festivals. Medieval people were funding their salvation with sin money. The system was so entrenched that when reformers tried to shut down church-owned brothels, they faced massive resistance from both religious and secular authorities. Too many people were making too much money from the arrangement to let moral concerns get in the way of profit. The church's prostitution empire lasted for centuries, only ending when Protestant reformers and changing social attitudes finally made the hypocrisy too obvious to ignore. But for hundreds of years, the institution that claimed to represent God's will on earth was running a sex trafficking operation that would make modern organized crime jealous. If you think modern contraception is complicated, wait until you hear about the medieval methods. Medieval birth control was so bizarre, so dangerous, and so completely ineffective that it makes modern contraception look like a miracle of science. Let's start with the classics: animal testicles. Because apparently, medieval people thought the solution to every sexual problem involved animal genitals. Women would wear pouches containing weasel testicles around their necks, believing this would prevent conception. The logic was that since weasels were considered sexually promiscuous but had small litters, their reproductive organs would transfer this controlled fertility to humans. But testicle jewelry was just the beginning. Medieval contraception included drinking potions made from everything imaginable: ground-up beaver testicles mixed with wine, powdered iron dissolved in water, and concoctions containing mercury. Yes, the poisonous metal. Some women poisoned themselves trying to avoid pregnancy, which technically worked because dead people can't get pregnant. The sneezing method was particularly ridiculous. Medieval physicians believed that if a woman sneezed immediately after sex, the force would expel the man's seed before conception could occur. So women would carry pepper or other irritants to induce sneezing right after intercourse. Physical barriers were equally insane. Women would insert everything from honey-soaked wool to crocodile dung into their vaginas before sex, believing these substances would block or kill sperm. Some used half a lemon as a cervical cap, which actually wasn't completely ineffective due to the citric acid, but was probably incredibly uncomfortable and definitely not recommended by any medical authority. The timing method was based on completely wrong information about female fertility. Medieval physicians believed women were most fertile during menstruation and least fertile mid-cycle, the opposite of reality. So couples trying to avoid pregnancy would have sex at exactly the wrong times, essentially guaranteeing conception while thinking they were preventing it. Magical contraception was a whole category of its own. Women would wear amulets containing written spells, carry special stones, or perform elaborate rituals involving everything from burning specific herbs to burying objects under full moons. Some contraceptive spells required the woman to walk backwards around a church 3 times while reciting prayers, because apparently God needed very specific instructions about birth control. The withdrawal method existed, but medieval physicians warned that it could cause serious health problems for men, including madness, blindness, and death. So even the one method that actually worked was discouraged by medical authorities, who thought incomplete ejaculation would poison the male body. It's easy to think that all medieval people lived under the same bizarre sexual rules, but the truth is, class changed everything. While nobles and royals were busy consulting astrologers, wearing magical underwear, and performing for an audience on their wedding night, peasants lived by a very different set of rules, mostly shaped by survival, necessity, and whatever the local priest could enforce. For peasants, life was hard, short, and full of uncertainty. Most didn't have the luxury of worrying about the right moon phase or the direction their bed faced. Privacy was almost non-existent. Families often lived in one-room houses, with everyone sleeping together on straw mattresses. If you wanted to have sex, you did it quietly, quickly, and hoped the kids were asleep. There were no elaborate bedding ceremonies, no magical belts, and certainly no fertility consultants. If a peasant woman got pregnant, it was just another mouth to feed, and if she didn't, it was probably a relief. But that doesn't mean peasant sex lives were simple or free from weirdness. Local customs, folk magic, and old superstitions still played a role. Some villages had their own bundling traditions, and midwives often acted as unofficial sex educators, passing down recipes for herbal potions and advice on timing. The church tried to enforce its rules everywhere, but in practice, most peasants ignored the more ridiculous restrictions. After all, when you're working from dawn to dusk just to survive, you don't have time to check the calendar for forbidden days. Meanwhile, the upper classes were trapped in a web of their own making. Nobles had to worry about producing heirs, maintaining alliances, and keeping up appearances. Their sex lives were public business, and failure to perform could mean scandal, annulment, or even political disaster. The pressure to conform to bizarre rituals and superstitions was immense, and the consequences of failure were far more severe than for the average peasant. The double standard was obvious. Nobles could get away with all kinds of sexual excesses as long as they kept up the right appearances, while peasants were punished for even minor transgressions if they got caught. The church's rules were supposed to apply to everyone, but in reality, money and power could buy a lot of forgiveness. So, what does all this tell us about the people of the Middle Ages and about ourselves? For one thing, it proves that human beings have always been obsessed with sex, no matter how much society tries to control, shame, or regulate it. The more rules and restrictions people face, the more creative and sometimes downright bizarre they become in finding ways around them. Medieval sexual practices weren't just about pleasure or reproduction. They were about power, control, superstition, and survival. The church used sex to maintain authority, the nobility used it to secure dynasties, and ordinary people used whatever means they could to find a little happiness in a harsh world, where the result was a society where sex was everywhere and nowhere at the same time, hidden behind closed doors, but also paraded in public rituals, legal trials, and church-run brothels. The Middle Ages were a time of contradictions. People believed in magic and miracles, but also in strict laws and punishments. They were terrified of sin, but couldn't resist temptation. They invented elaborate rituals to control sex, but those rituals often made things even stranger and more complicated. In the end, medieval sexuality was a mirror of the human condition, messy, confusing, and endlessly inventive. Maybe that's why we're still so fascinated by the sexual history of the Middle Ages. It's not just the shock value, though there's plenty of that. It's the realization that, for all our modern technology and enlightenment, we're not so different from our ancestors. We still struggle with the same questions about desire, morality, and the boundaries of acceptable behavior. We still invent new rules, break old ones, and look for loopholes wherever we can. The next time you hear someone talk about the good old days of moral purity, remember the bundling bags, the public bedding ceremonies, the magical underwear, and the church-run brothels. Remember that history is always stranger, messier, and more human than we imagine. So, what's the real lesson here? Maybe it's that human sexuality is too powerful, too complex, and too deeply rooted to ever be fully controlled by laws, rituals, or superstition. The Middle Ages tried and failed in spectacular fashion. Their bizarre sexual practices are a testament to the creativity, resilience, and sheer weirdness of the human spirit. If these disturbing, hilarious, and downright unbelievable facts made you question everything you thought you knew about history, you're not alone. The truth is, the past is full of stories that textbooks conveniently leave out, stories that remind us just how strange, surprising, and endlessly fascinating humanity can be. So, the next time you swipe right on a dating app, complain about awkward family gatherings, or wonder if your love life is a little too complicated, just remember, at least you don't have to perform for a room full of nobles, wear a fertility belt blessed by a priest, or eat a plate of roasted animal testicles to get in the mood. And if you want more horrifying, hilarious, and hidden truths from history, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button, because trust me, you haven't heard anything yet.